Good afternoon. I'd like to call this meeting to order, the book challenge hearing regarding the book Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi. Please stand for the flag salute. Thank you. The procedure for this hearing will be, the challenger will be entitled to up to 10 minutes to assert why the challenged material is objectionable and why. Board members may ask the challenger questions. A representative from the school district will then be entitled up to 10 minutes to outline the challenge procedures that have occurred to date, assert how the challenge material complies or does not comply with applicable criteria, and recommend an outcome regarding this material. Board members may, as the district representative the district representative questions. The district representative is Rob Manugian. Permit the challenger up to 2 minutes to rebut contentions raised by the district representative. The board may also ask the challenger questions. The board will then permit public comment. Following public comment, the board will make a determination regarding the challenged material. If the board deems that the challenged material does not meet applicable criteria, it can discontinue the use of it for any grade level or any group for which use is inappropriate. At this time, I will open the floor to the challenger, if she is present. Thank you. You have up to 10 minutes. And actually, pardon me, before you get started, I just want to make sure if any members of the public want to speak, that cards are in the back and you may hand them to Mrs. Termine over here to my left. Sorry, you may proceed.
Okay. Thank you to the board for your time to review the book challenge, and to Rob Magunin, Supervisor of Instructional Materials and Library Services, for his professional guidance through the established Sarasota County School Board Book Challenge policy. I'd also like to thank the committee of teachers and parents who engaged in this review and provided their insight. This interaction displays an established process in Sarasota County School District for parents and community members to challenge and find remedy for sensitive, controversial, or inappropriate conduct in our school libraries. Active engagement from parents is important and necessary. If a parent has concerns with resources in our schools, then I encourage them to respectfully adhere to this process designed by the Sarasota County School Board. I come before the board today as a concerned parent to make you aware of materials found in multiple libraries which are available to students in sixth grade through high school as a self-guided resource incorporating the tenets of critical race theory. This revolutionary dogma is repurposed from its Marxist origin to spark class conflict into the race-based conflict teachings of today, designed for an American audience. Regardless of the focus on class or race, the principles remain the same. Sixth grade through high school are formative years of relationship building, exploration, peer-to-peer engagement, and learning empathy for one another. As children gain those experiences and mature, organic, empathetic discussions and relationships help children to navigate this environment, advocate for themselves and others, and balance complex situations. These tender years are also ripe for indoctrination and theory-based persuasion. The content of this book is of concern due to its strongly one-sided perspective, use of critical race ideological language, and strongly editorialized inferences regarding intent available to children in our schools. The school board, using legislative guidance, has the ultimate responsibility to determine if this matter is legal and appropriate within our school libraries. As noted by other reviewers during the process, they too expressed some concerns about the content within the book and younger students' comprehension. Additionally, reviewers acknowledged the book was written in an editorial style from one perspective, which picked and chose historical facts to fit the author's opinion. In effect, this persuades students to a particular point of view inconsistent with the principles of state academic standards. Let us not be fooled. Critical race theorists are masters of language construction. These concerns should be explored further as some students in our district struggle with basic on-grade level comprehension, much less the ability to decipher common strategies used to evaluate an author's persuasive argument. That discernment is key for students to compare or to separate opinion from fact, especially when authors intertwine the two in tandem. Controversial topics, discussions, and idea sharing are all healthy and beneficial learning tools towards our shared humanity, when age appropriate, done with proper context on the subject matter, and knowing the author's bias and intent. I look to the elected school board and legal advisors for their guidance related to legislative principles and code to determine adherence to the statutory criteria of this material. As rightfully noted by the reviewers of this book is not included in instruction materials as outlined in Florida Statute 1006.28.2a. However, the context itself, Marxist origin, and age appropriateness as a self-guided resource should be evaluated by this board relative to Florida Statute 1006.28.2b as material used in school libraries. It should also be considered if this book meets the intended definition of supported materials, given its accessibility in school libraries, consistent with the principles of individual freedoms outlined in Florida Statute 1003.42.3a through F. This statute reads in part, the legislature acknowledges the fundamental truth that all persons are equal before the law and have inalienable rights. Accordingly, instruction and supporting materials on the topics enumerated in this section must be consistent with the following principles of individual freedom. No person is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously, solely by the virtue of his or her race or sex. No race is inherently superior to another. No person shall be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, disability, or sex. Meritocracy or traits such as a hard work ethic are not racist, but fundamental to the right to pursue happiness and be rewarded for industry. A person by virtue of his or her race or sex does not bear responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. And lastly, a person shall not be instructed that he or she must feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress for actions in which he or she played no part, committed in the past by other members of the same sex or race. It's up to this board to determine if these materials found in Sarasota County school libraries adhere to the legislative guidelines, fundamental truths, and statutes. As parents, guardians, and caregivers, we have a great responsibility to our children to take the opportunity to freely engage with our school system when we need to. Lastly, the school board, again, has the ultimate responsibility to make a decision on the age appropriateness and content of materials available in our school libraries. Whatever the board's final decision produces, we should acknowledge that a process of engagement is available with parents to raise concerns along with the school board. This is not the decision of one person. Rather, it is the conclusion of a democratic engagement of many who have provided insight into this review. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you, board members, do you have any questions or comments for the challenger? Seeing none, I want to thank you for taking the time and coming forward to share your opinion, and as you mentioned, highlight the process. So thank you very much.
You.
Moving on, we will call Mr. Manoogian to present the school district's perspective. You also have up to 10 minutes.
First, I'd like to thank the board for having me today and, of course, convening to discuss this important topic. It is very important. And secondly, I would like to expressly There you are. Mrs. Euchre and I, by now, are fast friends. We've been having conversations since May, and I really can't thank you enough. It's been a pleasure to work with her through this process. She originally contacted us in May of last year, and it did fall right at the end of the school year. So as our process defines, I contacted the school. She spoke with Mr. DeVerno at Venice Middle School. They had a conversation. Ultimately, it was decided that they would convene their work group to review the material, which they did prior to the end of the school year. And they decided at the school level, their recommendation was that the book be isolated for 8th grade only. I offered that to Mrs. Euchre, and at which point she made use of her right to appeal that, and it came back to me, and here's where I have to thank her again, because I reached out and said, it's the end of the school year, everyone's leaving for the summer, and she was wonderful in agreeing to hold off until the fall, and then as you all know, we had a hurricane, then we had another hurricane. So this process has been taking place for quite some time. Ultimately, we did convene a district-level work group that I oversaw the work. Again, I think it's important to recognize that this process works and that I don't, similar to our textbook adoption, district staff, we don't really have any say. We coordinate, we run the process, we guide and direct. Ultimately, it's up to those work groups to make a decision and decide what they view. That work group impressed me. At the school level, I think it's important to say that I don't really have a hand in that. That's done at the school site, so I'm not privy to exactly what happens at those meetings. I just get the results back. Once it comes to the district level, though, I am running those meetings, listening to the conversation, providing guidance and advice if asked. There were some wonderful conversations in that district work group about content and the age level at which that content was available to students. I would say at that time, some of the conversation fell to the breakdown between what is considered a self-selected reading material and what is viewed as an instructional material. And we did, and I think that's really important. I know Mrs. Euchre mentioned that, but I think it's important for the board and everyone else to fully understand that the way we view that instructional material versus a self-selected text in a library. And I know that there are statutes and guidelines for those self-selected materials as well. However, the work group seemed to believe that the point of view of the appeal was that this was CRT and violated House Bill 7. And forgive me, I mix up the sevens as I refer to them. House Bill 7, 1557, and 1467. So House Bill 7 related to CRT and conversations about race. And that's where we differentiated between, because the bill specifically states that those materials used for instruction. And this book is not being used for instruction in the district. So that conversation, I guided them through that conversation. There still were some concerns about age level appropriateness for 6th graders. Ultimately, it was decided that if a 6th grader picked up that book in a self-selected capacity and then got 2 or 3 pages into it and had trouble understanding, that ultimately they would put the book back, and they weren't being directed to read that book. So ultimately, the district work group's decision was to have the book remain accessible grades 6, 12, where it is already currently available in our district. At that point, I contacted Mrs. Euchre, and she availed herself of her appeal process once again, which leads us to today. So essentially, not having seen that process, I've been in this position for 10 years, and I've been around this. I served on some committees, district level challenge committees. Nothing is, in my time, has ever risen to the level of a board challenge. It is wonderful to see the process at work and be proud of the way it works, knowing on both sides that parents and citizens have the right to avail themselves of that process. And then, you know, the professionalism that I saw and witnessed from our teachers and staff, and having real conversations about those. It wasn't just closed-minded. We met for nearly 2 hours while they hashed it out the best they could. So, you know, at that point, that's an overview of how the process runs essentially here. I don't know if at this point you have questions for me that pertain to that process, but I would be happy to answer.
Thank you so much. Do members of the board have any comments or questions for Mr. Manoogian? Mrs. Rose, and then I have Mr. Edwards.
I have a question relative, Mr. Manoogian, to, first off, I just want to say thank you for all the work that you and your team, Mrs. Meckler and so forth and so on, have done on this. I very much appreciate it. My question is under the non-instructional materials criteria, and it states that a book self-select should be without bias or indoctrination. Are you confident, you and your team, that this particular book doesn't contain bias or indoctrination?
Are you asking me, just to clarify, are you asking me personally or professionally in our conversations?
Professionally.
Okay. So
Of
professionally, those conversations that we have had revolve around the fact, outside of this being a self-selected text, revolve around the fact that this presents clearly a side of an issue. And even the people that I have worked with and have read the book in a professional capacity, not weighing in on this, fall on all sides. And though the message may not be one that they necessarily agree with, they also see the value in the fact that this material was presented as a side of an issue, and that there will be other sides and other perspectives. And I think it's important that instructional materials and library materials, as indicated, I don't have it in front of me, and it's one of the pieces of legislation I don't have memorized, but also require that materials present multiple sides of issues. And that while this book may not be everyone's cup of tea, it does present a side of an issue, and that when read as more of an op-ed piece, that there is value in that material. The author states multiple times, this is not a history book. I'm not trying to, I'm paraphrasing him, but not trying to portray this as this is everything that happened exactly the way I write it. And I think that is the consensus, that is my consensus from a professional level, and the consensus of others that have read this material outside the scope of the district review process. Because again, I don't weigh in on those meetings. I don't have anything other than to guide and answer questions, provide resources in terms of legislation. So the district level committee was given copies of all the legislation and told to read the book from that perspective.
Thank you very much for that clarification.
Thank you very much. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. If I understand the process correctly, I think you may, and this is what I was told, the original process started with the parent and the school only, and the original decision was that those parents' child would be prevented from checking out the book. Was that the first decision that was rendered?
So I can't speak to that specific statement. So policy as it stands right now puts the onus on the school's principal to originally have a conversation with the parent. And whatever resolution they discuss can be accepted at that point. So, the thinking from me is that that original conversation would include, we understand you're concerned about this material. We can certainly flag your child's library account so that if they go to check this material out, a message will come up that says, parent requests that this book not be circulated to the student. In some cases, that may satisfy the complainant, and they may say, you know what, that's perfect, I didn't realize I could do that, and the process would end there. If that conversation doesn't reach an amenable conclusion, then it would move to a more formal process, which happens at the school level, which is the school review. And then, in this case, the recommendation from the school review was that it be relegated to 8th grade only. And again, I mean, there's no judgment there in saying that in this case, Mrs. Euchre said, no, I would like to appeal that and move the process further. And then once it hits my level, the impacts of that are far-reaching, because now we're at the district level, and now any decision that district committee makes touches all levels. It leaves the school site, and now it touches potentially, if the district committee were to say, you know what, we believe this book or any book belongs 11th and 12th grade access only, or just high schools, that would impact all schools. So I hope I answered your question.
I appreciate your explanation. Mr. Duggan, as per our conversations, was the original conversation between the school and the parent, the first recommendation back to the parent was, your child won't be allowed to check out this book. Does that resolve the issue?
Yeah, I don't know specifically what that conversation looked like. The challenger might be able to weigh in, but yes, that would theoretically resolve the situation if that's what occurred.
Okay, so my understanding then, I mean, this is what I've been led to believe, that was the resolution, which to me should satisfy my child. I don't want my child to read this book for all of the reasons that have been described. Bias, two sides of the issue, all this, that, the other thing. I don't want my child to read this book. So then that was appealed. And then we convened yet another group of parents and teachers, and I'm trying to ascertain, and I appreciate your commitment to the process, let's say, you and your professionalism to see the process through from start to finish, through 2 hurricanes, 2 school terms, all of that, and to keep the ball moving along. So I appreciate that. But so then we have a second panel who have to read the book, who have to get involved, and the decision was, okay, how about if we just allow 8th graders and above to read the book, and then that decision was appealed. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the first part would have been the conversation with administration. The second part technically would be the school-based process that I think you're referencing, and then the appeal, which moves it to my level. I mean, my level more formally than just, hey, we have a parent who's concerned, how do we do this?
Right.
Which comes out of the school, so.
And if you had to take a guess about how many hours you, Mrs. Meckler, the principal, teachers had to be involved in this process, could you take just a ballpark?
So I'm self-preservation here. So I'm certainly
There's no
not,
right or wrong answer.
No. So I'm certainly not. I don't want to stand up here and say, oh, it's a light lift on my part. Have at it. I just, But at the same time, my role is somewhat limited, right? I read the book. I read the book because I want to, and I want to get a better understanding. From the school-based committee, we kind of stretch it out over 3 weeks. We have to pull people together. That takes sometimes a little bit of time because teachers are doing this voluntarily. parents are doing this voluntarily. And then it's a matter of giving them a reasonable amount of time, because you can imagine a teacher's workload, anybody's workload in general, without saying, here, you know, you're not necessarily reading this book for pleasure because you want to, but you're being asked to. So, you know, however long it takes to read the book and then convene a meeting and have a meeting. So we have a meeting at the onset, an hour or so, just to, I can lay down the ground rules, provide any documentation that they may need or want, and then, you know, however long it takes to read the book, and then reconvene, and that meeting goes until we have an opinion to provide. So that can go, I mean, in the case of the district committee, it went almost 2 hours, you know, I mean, with conversation. So I don't know how you ballpark that in terms of, you know, it took a month, but it wasn't a month
Wasn't a
full of
month
work.
of
It's not a
full-time.
month, it's
Okay.
not a month of work.
Mr. Duggan, I'm also under the impression through my inquiries that the expense the school district has incurred around stamped is around $20,000. It's not firm, as here's the final number, but it's a ballpark number that was given to me. Does that sound about right to you?
Well, I can't talk to the entire district. I can tell you that at least as far as my review of it, I was asked by one of your colleagues to read it. It took me 6 or 7 hours to read the book. It's about 250 pages. The copy I had, 250, 260 pages. Pretty big font, but I had to labor a little bit through it, frankly, because it's pretty dense content. I did that this past weekend. So, you know, obviously my hourly rate is what that is for that amount of time. You know, prior to putting these materials together, it probably was another 5 or 6 hours. You know, I had some meetings with Mr. Renoff, the acting superintendent. I've had various discussions with Mr. Mnuchin throughout this entire process to make sure that he had the proper legal guidance and knew what the proper statutes were. And really, these statutes jump around, as you all know, from reading the materials I put together for you. So I don't know. I probably have all in on this from a legal standpoint, 11 or 12 hours, I would say, total. Maybe 15, somewhere in that ballpark at my hourly rate. So I'd say that would be around $5,000 for just my involvement, very, very roughly.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, what I want to try and get to is that I just really appreciate what you said about it's the other side of an issue. I also spent time with the book, and I think the public sentiment that I have gotten from parents is that they appreciate the school district's concern in terms of making sure their children have the opportunity to examine both sides of an issue and to research when possible both sides of an issue, and that in turn leads to critical thinking. So I just want to close with that for now, and I appreciate all of your time, all of your effort, and the team as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Marinelli, I got it right.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for all the hard work. I have a question. Can you please explain how the team or anybody decides what is age appropriate for a student to read?
So excellent question, and I don't know how great of an answer I can give you, to be honest with you, right? So, you know, in considering, we were presented with a unique challenge here. And that challenge that I expressed to Mrs. Euchre as well was this process started before legislation became law on July 1, 1467, and other pieces of legislation guiding those things. And that's not to excuse it away, but when we started the process, I communicated with district staff, I communicated with Ms. Euchre that we would be starting this process using the policies and what we had in front of us when the challenge was started. you know, to determine what is age and grade level appropriate, we have some resources, right? We try to consult, and we did, and I asked them to, right? Consult professional review sites. I mean, that's echoed in law now and required of district media specialists to do, but consult, you know, get those recommendations from sources, whether crowdsourced, whether professional review sites that made age recommendations. One of the, again, another unique factor with this book is there are 3 versions of this book. There is an elementary version. There is a, what I would call a secondary version, which is the book before you. And there is the original publication, which I would say marketed, in as much as I don't like using the term because it has weird connotations, it's an adult book. So, you know, the decisions are based on those teachers and their point of view from the students they serve and the students they teach. That's my opinion. I mean, no one's telling them, well, this book was written for. So you would have teachers or staff make the argument that if they're serving a gifted population, those kids can comprehend content at a higher level. Well, that is true. We also then have to have the conversation about content appropriateness for those students as well. So yes, they can absorb more maybe, but so this book fell into that gray area, and we had the school principal that served on the district committee who raised concerns about the accessibility of this text for younger kids, 6th graders. And it wasn't that he found, or anyone on the committee necessarily found it inappropriate, it was just the density of the content. So you heard Mr. Duggan say, it's pretty dense. It can be pretty dense. And again, I go back to what continued to come up through this process. This is a self-selected text. And if I can step outside of my professional self for a second and say if I were in 6th grade and I pulled this book off a shelf, I probably would have gotten about 10 pages in and I would have gone, put it back on the shelf. So, I mean, that's why I think it's so important that, yes, we do bear a responsibility to provide students with content that is appropriate. But at the same time, we need wide and varied content and self-selected text that they have the right to put back. So we afford our students, especially young students, they have, and I'm not saying right or wrong, right? They have very few. Their lives are controlled as they should be and manipulated by their parents and adults in their lives. If going to the library and choosing a book that they want is a little bit of freedom for those kids, then I view that as very important.
Well, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot.
No,
Just because this comes up.
Yes.
And as a former teacher, I've had to answer that kind of like you did, because it's a very gray area. But I read the book too, and I agree. It was a difficult read as far as the density of it. I thought the same thing. If I taught middle school, I know my kids would have put it back on the shelf because most want to enjoy it. Not to say that's not enjoyable for all, but that's a hard read because of the density of it and the way it's written. So thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Mr. Duggan?
Yeah, I just want to add to that point. When this process started was prior to the legislation. Typically, the legislature will pass a bill, and then the administrative agency, in this case, the Department of Education, will issue guidance on what the legislation means. I just want to point out that after the school-based and district-based process concluded, the Department of Education did put out factors regarding what is considered age and grade appropriate, which are included in your materials. But just to be clear, those were not available to Mr. Mnuchin or to the school-based process prior to that. I wanted to point that out for clarity.
Thank you. Well, first I want to thank you, Mr. Mnuchin. I think that I said this over the past, particularly last year or so, you've had a very challenging, you've been at the helm of a very challenging year, but a very important role. And something that you've said, and I want to underscore that, is through this process is really, really important, and the way and grace that both you and the challenger have approached it, I really want to commend you all for that. I know that with Mr. Renoff and even Mr. Duggan and myself, it has afforded, and even in my home and with other people in the community, has afforded a very healthy dialogue of where is this the appropriate level, what is our role in this matter, and how do we balance the multitude of scales, because I believe that is genuinely where everyone wants to find ourselves. And when I think about what this journey this last year in particular has looked like when it comes to evaluating the current books that we have on there and that demand, but there has always been a process to allow a parent or a member of our community, whether or not they have a child in our school district, to bring forward a challenge of instructional material as well as library books. And that's been the case for a while. And so I just wanted to highlight that because that's not new. And I think that's important because it's an engaging our community who is a stakeholder in the public education system that we have and are a part of the funding process. So I want to implore everyone that is something we welcome. And if you look at this as an example, it's a healthy discussion and we figure out where we go. One of the questions I have is starting with the book entering into the library book. Do we know when this book entered into our circulation?
I didn't check every copy. It seemed that most copies entered about 2019, when they were added to the system.
Okay. And something that, because when I read it, it is, a lot of the things that you highlighted is that it is very clearly one-sided, and it doesn't dismiss the narration, really underscores that this is that perspective. And overarching, I think, when we'll get to age appropriateness and context in a moment, but overall, it's very clear that it's one-sided. And I think there's many books and different material that we'll have that are going to offer a one-sided vantage point. And that's healthy to know that this is one-sided, as long as the reader is understanding that is in fact, with context, this is a one-sided vantage point that's not necessarily the whole fact, and you would benefit from seeing another perspective, even if it is self-selection. So when you see a book like this in 2019, it's not, this has kind of been this hot topic, if you will, for the lack of a better term, with CRT and anti-racism and what have you. When we add a book like this, do we look at something like a counter perspective as in entering into circulation to balance it?
Well, just as a point of clarification, and I continually forget this. So this was a Sunshine State Young Readers Award winner.
And for the audience and for everyone, what specifically, can you clarify what that means?
So the FAME sponsors, the organizations in the state get together and they provide reviews and lists of books at varying levels. K2, 3.5, 6.8, and then Florida Teens Read is the high school version of that. That is sponsored by FAME, and what they do, and you can see this posted everywhere, and we try to make sure that message is heard. FAME explicitly states these books are intended for self-selected reading and not designed to be used as pieces of instruction. So that I'm going on a disclaimer for FAME, right? So just so that's out there, right? They put out these award winners, and as a matter of course, we have over the years purchased a set. Schools buy those sets of books for their students.
So this may not be a fair question for you, but when you say it like that, is it arguable that this package of books year over year are, with their clearly identified as not to be instructional material, and they're solely self-selection? Like
having conversations with people in FAME and past presidents and current presidents in FAME, their goal is to promote the love of reading, and they're in the joy of reading. And the thinking there is to differentiate between what a teacher or an instructor may require them to read, as much as a student may enjoy it, versus a student going to a shelf and going, that looks really cool, I want to read that, and pulling it off and sitting at home on their own or wherever, reading it on their own, versus, okay, here's the book that we're reading now. And again, regardless of how much the students may enjoy that, they know, I have 2 weeks to read this book, and I have to write a book report, or I'm going to take this test on this book. So they go out of their way to make sure, like, these books are out. We're publishing these lists for students to find a book that they love You know, and I would tell you, and I'm going to, I have the opportunity and the microphone's in front of me.
Seize it.
I'm one of those kids. I'm not a kid anymore, but I'm one of those kids that found books and read everything. My father finished his education in 8th grade. My mother is 90. My father, up until the time he passed away, they read a book a week. I was never, no one ever said, don't read that, can't read that. I mean, and I'm not making the argument, I'm just saying. So as a teacher and somebody involved in education, there's nothing to me more powerful than a kid finding a kid who may be isolated, marginalized, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. A kid seeing themselves in a piece of text and going, huh, somebody else thinks, feels, acts, does the way I do. So I just, you know, thank you, but that's not, you know, I had that opportunity. So, you know, when we have these conversations, the opportunity to remain neutral in that, with that understanding, and have that conversation with people who may feel differently, and that's fine. But when we talk about fame, I guess that's why I was so emphatic that that's why those books are there. That's why those books are there.
No, I appreciate it, and thank you for that clarification, because I'm familiar with Sunshine State standards, or not, readers, excuse me. And so when we do a package like that, when we still vet that package, right? I mean, they have these recommendations of here's a series of books for this year, and then our processes will pick the ones that we believe work for our district, right?
Not as formally as it will be moving forward with 1467. I mean, that's just the reality of it, right?
Okay.
So you know, with the understanding that books like that, and that really is at the district level about the only time we do something like that, and the lift in providing those books for schools was more financial than anything else, to say, you know, this is important, and we want these books because schools, you know, built competitions around the kids reading them and promoted them. And you know, when we have, you know, our wonderful library texts in our schools, but there's a wide and varied knowledge base there, and it helps them focus on, here's something you can do in a package, right? Here are these award-winning books that were voted on by students and teachers and people all over the state. So.
Gotcha. No, thank you for that. One thing, I have a couple of questions here, and then I'm going to go to Mr. Duggan. You mentioned, and I know that this was the middle level, if you will, compared to the initial adult version. There's an elementary version. I didn't know that. Do we have the elementary version in our school district?
I'd have to, I haven't, my focus, I haven't checked. I would have to check. I honestly don't know.
Okay. And then thank you very much. To Mr. Duggan, so I know that the statute and evaluating instructional material versus self-selection, and can you walk us through that process as comparison? Because I think that the newer language, there is some areas where it's how they define it, and I want to make sure we're walking the appropriate line. So can you walk us through that evaluation?
Sure. So Florida Statute 1006.2A, sub 2A, creates two different sets of criteria for challenging a book. You heard the challenger earlier today reference 2B for self-select library material. So there's one set of standards for what's called instructional material, core instructional material. That's things like textbooks, required readings, things that strongly coincide with the classroom instruction. And it is a more, I would describe as a more stringent standard for, you know, what the state mandates that we instruct a student upon, every student. There is a more permissive standard for self-selected library materials and classroom books, which prior to recently have not been heavily regulated, with more recent regulation are now more so regulated. And there is a more permissive standard for self-select library materials. And so getting that determination right of whether this is an instructional material or a library material really dictates what set of criteria you would apply to this particular book. And recently, FDOE, the Florida Department of Education, has issued a proposed administrative rule that actually becomes effective in February, and has issued some guidance and some training to give more clarity about what factors are to be considered for self-selected library materials. And part of the legislation that passed in July, Mr. Mnuchin and Ms. Meckler and her team, are tasked with going through the entire library and all of the classrooms and all of the libraries in the schools, and applying the criteria in the statute to all of the books we have in this school district.
Thank you. And so, because I know, and again, one of the first questions I asked, given the timeline of this and understanding what transpired legislatively and then rulemaking and then the timeline, being right in the middle of it, recognizing, and I'm glad you highlighted that this was applied to the initial policy and the prior statutory language. But now that we're kind of in this transfer over time with more explicit directions, and even that it's not formally a rule that it's adopted yet, have we put this particular book now up against that standard that will likely be approved by the Department of Education from the library selection evaluate? Go ahead.
So I can tell you that when the district, even though we started the process in terms of what our local board policy was, my guidance to the district work group was I provided them with copies of House Bill 7, 1557, and 1467, and asked them to evaluate this material measured up against those to determine. And I believe you may have that somewhere.
Yes.
Okay, what I provided the committee. So I just want to clarify that point. So in terms of looking at it against current law, as current as possible when we did the review, I believe that was done.
No, I appreciate that. 'Cause
Okay.
these are the questions we get from many out there. So yes, and thank you. So for most of my questions have been answered. I have additional thoughts, but I certainly want to get to public comment. Are there any other questions for Mr. Duggan or Mr. Mnuchin by the board? Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like legal counsel from the most objective perspective that we have in the new legislation, even that hasn't been passed yet. Is this book in compliance from your legal standpoint, having done the research and work that you've done?
Okay, so my opinion is if this was an instructional material, it would probably not pass the legal scrutiny required of instructional materials as the way the state defines them. Importantly, and this is something I just learned today, if this book was acquired in 2019, that would have been prior to the state rules changes regarding required instruction. So it would have, if it was instructional material, it would have, at the time of acquisition, been in compliance. Since then, a rule has been passed that would make it prohibited. As far as being a library material, I don't think it contains pornography. I think it's an open question and arguable both ways, whether it's age and grade appropriate based on the most recent criteria provided by the Florida Department of Education. And I think it probably likely is suited to the needs of the student, if it is age and grade appropriate. So I think you could make an argument either way, whether it meets the criteria or not. I really think that this is a very tough case with this book right on the edge of permissibility or not.
Clarification, please. From your legal opinion, you're saying that the gray area is in the age and grade level appropriateness?
Yes, that's what I think. And I think just the factor that was a question earlier today is, whether it is with bias or indoctrination, it certainly is a persuasive piece. Not unlike most books, frankly. I would describe it as in my own words, in one sentence, would be a history of, systemic discrimination against African Americans in a way that disadvantaged them, and approaches how to overcome that. And they kind of talk a lot about what's called an anti-racist approach being preferable to a assimilist approach or a segregationist approach. It really is, even though they call it throughout the book, not a history book, really a history of systemic racism against African Americans. So I do think that would be within the definition of critical race theory as the Department of Education has, since we acquired this book, defined it, and I think that that rule applies to instructional materials and would be prohibited under that. But as a self-selected library material, I think it turns on whether it is without bias or indoctrination, and I think many people would have many different opinions on that. I don't know that there is a right or wrong answer to that, and that really is the issue here, is I think it's right on the edge of whether it does that. It certainly is persuasive. I don't know if it quite gets to bias and indoctrination, frankly, is my opinion, but that's just my opinion, and I think reasonable people would differ on that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are no more comments or questions, Mrs. Termine, do we have any comment cards? Oh, pardon me. I'm sorry. I need to go to my cheat sheet. This is the first one we've done. I think anyone up here has done, so I apologize. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Manoogian, thank you so much for your valuable insight. I now will call up the challenger to offer any rebuttal, and you will have up to 2 minutes to do so. And my apologies. Just getting prepared.
It's never easy being the first one. And Rob, it was great to actually meet you in person. So I just, again, want to express like my gratitude for the professionalism, the guidance that Rob has shown through this, and your willingness to hear this. I did want to make one clarification. Mr. Edwards had asked about, did I talk to the principal? I don't actually recall that I actually talked to him. We talked about that there was, I could, make sure that my child didn't take it out, which is fine. I'll just, for full disclosure, my child has read this book. We do a book club and we discuss, books. And so that's kind of how this, and this was actually 2 years ago, so I've read it actually 3 times. So maybe I'm up to like 15 grand on, on analysis. And, again, I just want to clarify that we have a process in place, and I'm very thankful for that. I think this is healthy discussion about what's appropriate in our school districts. This is not about banning books. It's not starting bonfires in the middle of the, of the courtyard of things that we don't agree with. This is about age appropriateness. This is about understanding the impact within our society, within our children, within their interaction, and also their emotional well-being to take that information in, as well as interest. I think, we're all humans, and we understand that, we've been in this really crazy world for about 3 years-ish, right? And, nobody likes to talk about race. I don't know what it is. I don't mind. I grew up in a lot of people that didn't look like me, has, different, different languages, all of that. So it's not an issue or a hard discussion to talk about. What I do think that we want to make sure that it's age appropriate. We do want to make sure that there's some guidance too in that. So I just wanted again to say I really love this process. Not that I want to come up every month and do this, but I do really appreciate that you all took the time, the effort, and the interest to be here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, members of the board, we have 20 comment cards. We usually have 3 minutes for comments. We have a hard stop at 2 o'clock. This is unusual. We actually added to air. Initially, it was scheduled for 1 hour, but we did not believe that would be afforded enough time, which I'm glad we didn't. So I made a suggestion that we move it to 2 minutes so we can get through every single individual and afford ourselves the opportunity to finalize and conclude this, giving us the next time for our, because we have a scheduled executive session with the attorney. So is that, are there any objections to moving it to 2 minutes so that every person can speak, and we'll allow ourselves to conclude? Mr. Edwards, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to object to that because I was the proponent of public comments being at 2 minutes. And this board has taken it and moved it to the other direction. What that is saying to me is that in every public topic that this board would then decide if it's 2 minutes or 3 minutes. And I think since this board has advertised 3 minutes and in general and wants comments to be 3 minutes, whether we're here until whenever, then that's what it takes. So that's just my opinion.
Thank you for that. No, I appreciate that, and I did consider that. However, at the same time, thank you. I do obviously have a history of supporting public comment, but I also want to make sure this is a little bit different than our usual public comment. The alternative would be we suspend and we do not conclude today. So I'm going to actually move that we afford each speaker 2 minutes so we don't take any additional time. I have a motion on the floor. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. I have a motion and a second. Are there any comments? Members, can we please vote? Mrs. Marinelli? Yes. Mr. Edwards?
No.
Mrs. Rose?
Yes.
Mr. Enos?
Yes.
And the chair votes aye, and the motion passes to afford each speaker 2 minutes, 4-1. So, starting with the first speaker, we'll have Mrs. Robin Williams, and then after that, Lila Newcomb.
As a Jew, it's chilling to me that you're considering the banning of Stamped. It's an excellent addition to any middle or high school library, and frankly should be part of the curricula dealing with American history. It's written in an engaging style that holds the attention of teenagers interested in uncensored history. It challenges readers to question and reconsider their assumptions. It shows that people can change with new information and by examining and reflecting upon different viewpoints, including some of the historical figures the book discusses, like W.E.B. Du Bois. It's an eye-opener and is precisely the kind of book that helps students' intellectual growth. It poses important questions. Students need to read different viewpoints and learn how to think critically. To flourish in our world, students require broad educational opportunities that shouldn't be stifled because of the objections of some narrow-minded people. Those individuals already can write a note directing the school to prevent their child from accessing a particular book. That doesn't give them the right to deny the book to other people's children and limit their education. They can parent their own children, not everyone else's. This is supposed to be the freedom state. Remember, freedom for all, not just a few. One Holocaust survivor speaking with me this week about the potential stamp book ban said it brought to mind the prophetic words written in 1822 by the great German Jewish poet Heinrich Heine. Where they burn books, they will in the end burn human beings too. 100 years later, in 1933, the Nazis banned and then burned books. Whether or not humans wind up burned to death, we're already seeing a dramatic increase in hate crimes against the Jewish, LGBTQ, and other minority communities, resulting from the empowerment of bigots in the wake of Florida's anti-woke book ban and anti-gay legislation. In the same year the Nazis banned books, they took control of universities, starting with the hostile takeover of the university known for its liberalism and creativity, Frankfurt University, and then rolling over academia throughout Germany. The point of Holocaust education is to be able to connect the dots from the past, to see the warning signs today, and do something about it before it's too late. When you couple Florida's book bans with last week's hostile takeover of New College, one would need blinders on not to see the danger signs. Don't politicize our children's education. Don't ban books.
Thank you very much. Lila Newcomb and Cynthia Plug. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you once, please do jazz hands so we can get through and allow every single person to be heard. Thank you so much.
Hi, Leela Newcomb, and I am live-in grandma of 3 children in Sarasota Public Schools. And I have really enjoyed the professionalism that I've heard today. And what I was going to say is probably like a super oversimplified version of everything that's already been presented. So, you know, I guess my only thing is for one parent to continually try to rule what everybody else's child can or cannot read doesn't seem like the right thing to do. And, you know, give everybody I'm sorry, parental rights are one thing, but for one parent to decide for everybody is a serious overstep. That's my opinion. I have a 6th grade, one of my 3 grandchildren, 6th grade gifted. I can guarantee you that she would put the book back in 1 page because it's just not her interest. My older one would probably read it cover to cover, but there has been no harm found in it through the channels that were provided at the level below bringing it to the school board. It wasn't found dangerous, and it was not found to be against the law. So I just hope you guys will go along with that. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Cynthia, I'm sorry, is it Plug? And then I have Michael Weddle. I must not be getting that right, but
I just want to, sorry, Cynthia Flug, and I just wanted to say, Mr. Mnuchin, you've worked hard. So I appreciate that. I don't see a reason why there should be any limitation on the freedom of speech for this author to be presented. It goes against intellectual freedom, which librarians, I think, would want to promote. I don't think there's a reason to violate the American Library Association requirements that we have, to work against any type of censorship, since it didn't violate the laws. And I appreciate the process, which has now, since recommended by Teen Reads, that was 14 certified Florida media specialists that recommended the book for open, not as an instruction. Then we had the principal meeting, and if I count correctly, at least 22 district employees and curriculum specialists that were required to be on the committees to review this. I don't see that overturning it for use by the general public, by the general students, is a good way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Weddle and Lisa Scher.
Hello. I'm Dr. Mike Weddle. I'm on the board of directors for the Minnesota Branch Association for the Study of African American Life and Culture. I live in Venice. Where I grew up, everyone looked exactly like me. And I believe this is a book that Venice parents like myself should want in their library, and I thank the review committee for their due diligence. And I don't agree with everything in this book, but that doesn't mean that I think it has no value. It's written, I found it in a conversational style, one person's perspective of what he learned growing up and living in society. I wanted my own children to see things from perspectives outside of their bubble. That's what books do. They help us to learn empathy. I'm a doctor. I had to work with people, all kinds of people, and empathy was a very important skill in my career. If we remove this book, we need to be ready to remove other books. For example, the books of Helen Keller, writing about her experiences and reality that none of us can share and that none of us can know. Who on this board, I don't think anyone on this board is ready to say that one Black American's experience is not valid, and I don't think anyone on this board wants to make decisions about a parent's right to choose what their children can or cannot read. Banning a book in Venice, where I live, for me, is targeting white children. I grew up in white society. It's so racialized that it's very easy to remain unaware of one's position in the real world. Education is giving children tools to succeed. A book cannot make a person feel guilty. Let me say that again. There's no book that can make a person feel guilty. But a good book can help a person to learn empathy. And that's what students need to succeed in the world. I think that's why we're all here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lisa Scher and Tallulah Brand.
My name is Lisa Scher. I'm a Sarasota County resident and parent of a child who's enrolled in and attends school in the district. I'm here today to voice my opposition to removing the book stamp from the bookshelves of school media centers. I firmly believe that each parent, and I have huge respect for Mrs. Euchre, I believe that each parent has the right and the responsibility to determine the reading materials that they wish their child to access in the school library. But they do not have the right to determine what materials that my child may access or read. As most parents already know, the school district maintains a database of all books available in each school's media center. Any parent who has concerns about the reading materials available to their child may flag those books that they do not wish their child to read. This is a remedy which allows the complainant to exercise her parental rights while at the same time not infringing upon the rights of other parents. Instead, we're here today to hear whether the board will remove a book from the media center curtailing the parental rights of myself and other parents when a remedy already exists that will let the challenger exercise her parental rights. To proceed with the removal of this book is a violation of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and flies in the face of well-settled case law, which is higher than state statute. In 1982, the Supreme Court decided Board of Education versus PICO. In that case, a school board had rejected the recommendations of a committee of parents and school staff that it had appointed to review certain books, much like the current book challenge procedure that we have here. The court held local school boards may not remove books from school libraries simply because they dislike the ideas contained in those books and seek by their removal to prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. In the Pico case, the court relied on the previous decision in Tinker versus Des Moines School District and stated that local schools have broad discretion, but the discretion must be exercised in a manner that comports with the transcendent imperatives of the First Amendment.
I'm just trying to wait till you finish that sentence. Thank you. Tallulah Brand. Tallulah Brand and Kia Brand.
Hi, my name is Tallulah Brand. I'm a student at Booker Middle School. I asked to be here because I think it's ridiculous for STAMP to be banned, considering the reason, racism. You want to ban a book saying racism isn't right, and your reason is that this book is racist? We can't start banning books just because one person has an issue with it. At this rate, we won't have any books left. Happy Black History Month. Now let's ban a book saying racism is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. Kia Brand and Nancy McElroy.
It's actually Kaya.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'm Kaya Brand. I'm a Sarasota County resident and have a child that attends a Sarasota County middle school. As you could see. Banning books is censorship and against students' First Amendment rights. The Supreme Court has decided this very issue and concluded school officials' removal of books for the purpose of restricting access to the political ideas or social perspectives discussed in them when that action is motivated simply by the official's disapproval of the ideas involved was a violation of the First Amendment. A parent in the district has asked that a book be removed because she finds that there's CRT in that book. Removing one book discussing racism doesn't make racism go away. The book stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You tackles the difficult topics of slavery, racism, and how racist viewpoints have shaped America. This book has been adapted for 6th to 12th grades by award-winning and best-selling YA author Jason Reynolds. It covers tough topics, engaging kids that read the book to start conversations and thoughts of what they can do to combat racism. Since the book is a self-selected library book, it doesn't fall under House Bill 7 and can't be used as a reason to remove the book. One of the biggest problems I have is one parent is trying to make the decision for what books should be available in the district's library. The parent just mentioned that her child read the book, so why should she take that right away from my child? Where do we draw the line, and what parents get to decide for the rest? The parent was given the option to limit her child's access to the book, just like every parent in the district is able to do. I am perfectly capable of making the decision for my child, and I definitely do not need help with that. As the author Jason Reynolds once said, books don't brainwash, they represent ideas. You have a right to disagree with those ideas. Adults aren't afraid of books, they're afraid of the conversations.
Thank you. Nancy McElroy, Joan Stoughton-Burrow.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for taking the time, and Tom, thank you for trying to get us 3 minutes. I'm a retired high school counselor, but I also worked at a middle school and an elementary school. Spent a long time doing that. My mother was a high school English teacher. I grew up like you did. I still read a book a week. And it's a wide variety of books. And I'm not going to bore everybody too much, I hope. But I have a few quotes because that's what I do. I research. And I realize we're not talking about censorship or banning books, plural. But we are talking about banning a single book because a single parent has decided it's inappropriate. As far as age appropriateness, I think children know when it's age appropriate if they read the book and understand it. And this book was written for teens, and I think teens can handle it. Censorship is the child of fear and the father of ignorance. Lori Halse Anderson. There are worse crimes than burning books. One of them is not reading them. Joseph Brodsky. Any book worth banning is a book worth reading. Isaac Asimov. If a public school were to remove every book because it contains one word deemed objectionable to some parent, then there would be no books at all in our public libraries. Peter Scheer. Banning books gives us silence when we need speech. It closes our ears when we need to listen. It makes us blind when we need sight. Stephen Chomsky. Censorship is telling a man he can't have a steak just because a baby can't chew it. Mark Twain. If this nation is to be wise as well as strong, if we are to achieve our destiny, then we need more new ideas for more wise people reading more good books in more public libraries. This is John Kennedy. I'm going to finish
Thank you.
These libraries should be open to all except the censor. We must know all the facts and hear all the alternatives and listen to all the criticisms.
Thank
Let
you.
us
I'm
welcome
sorry. I need to be fair to everyone. Joan Stattenberg, Burrow, and Janice Blowers. Ma'am, I'm sorry. That's very unfair to everyone else behind you. If you could please let us go. Thank you.
Joan Stoutenborough. We live in Osprey. I'm a retired public school educator, a teacher, and an administrator. I'm a mom, a grandma, and I'm an avid reader of many different genres. A couple of points that have hit me from other comments made. CRT, critical race theory, is not a public school subject ever taught anywhere. It is a law school second-year class as far as I can tell. I also am noting that we have a room full of mostly white people making decisions about what is the study of racism, whether it is appropriate or not. In general, I think one parent doesn't have the right to prevent 40,000 other students from access to a book. If you don't want to read it, don't. It's very simple, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Janice Blowers and Mary Alice Mulligan.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Janice Blowers. I'm a Sarasota County resident and parent. Both of my kids are out of the county schools now, but graduated from what was once a beautiful and hopefully will continue to be a beautiful and vibrant school district. My oldest child was valedictorian of her class. She went on to become a double Ivy, and she consistently brought home as a part of her curriculum, not as a part of self-selected, but as a part of curriculum, things that were difficult, things that we did talk about. So I'm not really here to talk about whether or not a tween version of a book about understanding how racism operates is CRT. As the prior woman said, it is not. Critical race theory is something you will find in a graduate school program. I guarantee you, no one is teaching CRT in our middle schools. We don't have the time. We don't have the money. We don't have the manpower. Anyway, it sounds like this didn't even violate the rule, honestly. It was a self-select, not a curriculum. So not sure why we're here. But as we have been here, I'm a little concerned to hear questions about, well, who vets the FAME package? It's a selection of books for public school libraries vetted by Florida media specialists and educators. I really don't want to be here next year on a book challenge on a FAME book. We want our kids to read. We want our kids to enjoy reading. We just can't be going through the libraries. Who's going to go through all these libraries and figure out, is every single book okay? That's just not what we want to spend our money and our time on.
Thank you. Mary Alice Mulligan and Marjorie Peter.
I gather Mary Alice is not here. My name's Marjorie Peter. Delighted to hear that so many people read the book. That was my first reaction. Oh my God, they're talking about removing a book. I have to read it. I don't remember looking at the issue of race and slavery through the eyes of an agitated, angry black person before. I'm a 74-year-old white grandmother. I need to read more books like this. I'm anxious to discuss it with my grandchildren. And my issue is I certainly don't want them restricted from accessing a book. I applaud the professionalism. You've done your appeals. But to me, once the appeals have been met and answered through school board procedures, then you're kind of at the end of the road. Then you're asking for opinion not based on curriculum standards. You're getting close to book banning, and to me, that doesn't have a good smell. Tread carefully. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sarah Parker and Caitlin, I can't read that, Danny Sametz.
Hi, my name is Sarah Parker. I'm the president of Women's Voice of Southwest Florida. I want to echo the Booker Middle School students, say thank you for saying Happy Black History Month. The irony that we're sitting here discussing Black books on Black History Month. So I want to start it off with a quote from Malcolm X. Why, when all of my ancestors are snake bitten and I'm snake bitten and I warn my children to avoid snakes, what does that snake sound like accusing me of hate teaching? Learning Black history and Black children learning about their history pivots them further. It's been proven. Reading books about Black history helps you understand where we came from as people. It helped me stay inside when everybody my age was running the streets and getting in trouble. Being a reader saved my life. You know, one of the things, I read Black history and my friends are white, my husband's white, I have mixed children. It didn't make me just hate white people. It made me a strong Black woman. It made me want to make my ancestors proud. It helps me educate my friends and my family. I do hear a lot of white parents talking about their white children not being able to read it, but what about the Black children not being able to read this? And I just want to say, this book is about generational trauma. Anybody in the room is listening. And I am proud for my people. I am proud to see my people getting further than that general trauma. Black people weren't just taken and sold, they were enslaved, they were raped. Their children were snatched from their mother's arms. Black backs were whipped until some of them died. Black people were bitten and chased down by dogs. Then slavery ended. They were purposefully not educated. America didn't stop there because once they were free, they were lynched and forced to work low wages as sharecroppers. Then we were given voting, and that was snatched away too because they made us fear voting. Let's not pretend it was just the government, it was good old white citizens. Does anyone know what year we're at right now going through Black history? During that, we were allowed in the same school that children and adults threw rocks. Board, where were your grandparents and parents during segregation? What did they do? Were you allowed to bring a person of color home to date? After desegregation, we faced redlining. And just a quick fact, did you know there's still properties on Longboat and Lido Key that have in the deeds that state you cannot sell to Black or brown people. You cannot sell that property to Black or brown people.
Thank you. Martha, Caitlin, Danny Sametz. Martha Magley Kane. And please correct me if I butcher your name, because it seems like I'm doing so.
That's okay, you did good. My name's Katie Danahy Sametz. I'm the vice president and founder of Women's Voices at Southwest Florida. And so to the best of my understanding, and Madam Chair, please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if we can dialogue, but it sounds like this book is not a part of any curriculum that's being taught. The challenge is to ensure that the schools can't carry a single copy of this book that a student could happen to come upon in the library and check out. And if they want to check it out and their parents don't want them to, there's a system in place to keep them from checking that book out. Is that correct? Oh, okay. Well, if that is correct, I don't fully understand what we're doing here. This seems like a non-issue, and it seems like censorship. It sounds like instead of parents wanting to be actively engaged in what their children are reading, they just want to eradicate any other perspective from public education other than their own. And it sounds a lot like 1933's Germany, and that scares me. I would love to echo the sentiments of every incredible speaker that has come before me today to bring up every single point that can't be ignored. And for those that haven't read the book, I'd like to just read a couple segments. That is what it truly means to think as an anti-racist, to think that there's nothing wrong with Black people, and to think that racial groups are equal. There are lazy and unwise and harmful individuals of African ancestry, and there are lazy and unwise and harmful individuals of European ancestry. No racial group has ever had a monopoly on any type of human trait or gene. Not now, not never. That doesn't seem like indoctrination. That seems like common sense. And just for the record, on record, Governor DeSantis' WOIA team defined woke as the belief that there are systemic injustices in American society and the need to address them. And that doesn't sound like a radical agenda. That sounds like being a good person. So with that, please don't ban this book.
Thank you. Martha Magley Kane, Cynthia Smith. How'd I do on that last name? Did I get it? Thank you.
Okay, obviously for my T-shirt, I have the same viewpoints as most of the other speakers here today. I'm also a 74-year-old grandmother. I have two granddaughters who, one will soon graduate. I will say that she was accepted at New College and won't be attending because of what's going on there. This book, I keep hearing one-sided, this is a one-sided opinion piece, and I felt when I read it, it was full of inconvenient truths and truth nonetheless. We cannot start banning books. I find it terrifying, just the idea of banning books. As was said, Mrs. Uker's child has read this book, so I don't understand why, like she said, why this is even being discussed. If her child's read it, why can't my child, if I had one still in school, why can't my junior year granddaughter read it? I will buy it for her and suggest that she read it because it is excellent. I just, please, don't start this process of banning books because I think I really appreciated what Mr. Duggan said, that this book doesn't get to the bias and indoctrination level. And I also wonder, is this decision made just by the members of the school board? Those are the only votes that go towards the banning of this book. Okay, that's scary. And when will this decision be made? When will we
don't
know?
normally go back and forth, but we are making a decision, but we conclude today at 2 o'clock.
Okay.
Thank you. Cynthia Smith, Elizabeth Barker.
Okay. My name's Cynthia Smith. I've had kids in the school system since 2006. We actually moved to this county in 2004 for the schools. 2 of my girls have now graduated from Venice High, go Indians, and I now have a second grader. I've been mostly satisfied with my public school experience over the last however many years and have experienced a lot of different perspectives. I'm me, I have my own values, I have the things that I teach my kids. I know when I send them to school, they're going to be exposed to things that I may not always agree with. 2 things that I've experienced over this course of, since they've been in school. In 2009, my then elementary school daughter had to sign a permission slip to view Obama's back to school speech. Not to opt out, but to actually view it. And that was in 2009. And then notably this year, this fall, my second grader, I went to a program after school. They worked really hard. They sang a lot of songs. And one of those songs was, I'm proud to be an American. Very religious undertones. I'm not religious. I didn't care. My daughter had fun. She was learning about different things. So with that being said, our school system provides a way for parents to challenge books, but gives them the option to put certain titles on a do not check out list. The book being challenged today is not used as educational or instructional material. It is adapted for our teenagers by Jason Reynolds, a renowned ambassador for young people's literature. It is merely one book amongst thousands available through our public schools to public school students to satisfy their curiosity and expand their knowledge. Our school libraries are not our classrooms. Our classrooms are governed by legislation, but our libraries should be a safe place for people to learn and grow and find different ideas. Any parent can censor what their child checks out based on their due diligence. And according to my parental rights, my children are allowed to, outside of classroom or educational experience, have exposure and access to different perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth Barker, Christine Herbig.
Hi there. I'm Liz Barker, and I'm the parent of 4 children, 6th grader, 4th grader, 1st grader, and a preschooler, and all of them are in Sarasota County Public Schools, so I, invested. And we did choose this district to live in because of the schools, so, so far, we appreciate the quality of education. But I am here to ask the school board to protect my parental rights to choose the books that my children read, and that they have a continued access to a wide variety of written material at school. I certainly respect, Ms. Euchre, your coming forward and your concerns, and as a fellow parent, I love that engagement. And I would love to dialogue with you sometime about it. We seem like kindred spirits, but, I just hope that people will respect my parental rights too, to choose what's right for my children. And in this case, we went through the process. It does not violate any law. It doesn't, there's certainly nothing pornographic about it. It's age appropriate. I did read the book cover to cover. I read the concerns and I read the committee decisions. And I agree with the committee. I would like my child to have access to this book. And I think the main thing I want to say is that our country was founded on principles of diversity of opinion, freedom of information. They're cornerstones of our democracy. Our founding fathers established our government based on the ideal of unity in diversity, e pluribus unum, like back from the very beginning. Respecting parents and their choices should never infringe on someone else's choices. So banning a book for all students based on one person's preference really does fly in the face of our democratic ideals, and I hope you don't.
Thank you very much. Christine Herbig and Rebecca McConnell.
Hi, I'm a retired public librarian, and this is, of course, I'm concerned about this. I'm going to read a statement from the Florida Library Association's Freedom to Read. We support parents' rights to choose materials for their own children, and this right extends to all parents. One parent may not infringe on another parent's right to determine which library materials are appropriate or beneficial for their children. We encourage parents to cooperatively select materials for their children, and we welcome and they are welcome to seek help from librarians or library professionals when choosing library materials. When I grew up here in Sarasota, segregation was just a fact of life, and we were socialized to accept it and expect it, and blacks were socialized to always consider white comfort, and sometimes considering that was a matter of life or death for them, to look down or to step off the sidewalk. Thank God that's improved. I am very concerned, being a lifelong Floridian, with the way that DeSantis is politicizing education and history and using our children as pawns in his pursuit of power. And I think that being able to say that something was legislated or this is what the law is, when we have people who are using the legislative process to manipulate, to pursue goals that are personal and political and not for the good of all people in the state, is very wrong. And I'm hoping that you don't consider banning this book. Everybody needs to read it. And the more reading the kids do, the better for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Rebecca McConnell, David Ford.
Hi, I'm a lifelong avid reader. In junior high, I read The Diary of Anne Frank, a book that was written from one-sided perspective. I also read books about slavery, murder mysteries, stories on abduction, the King James Bible, and even Helter Skelter, a book about the Manson family murders in junior high. I've not committed any horrific crimes. I don't have any immense feelings of guilt on behalf of my race, only empathy. And despite my varied interests in sometimes gruesome content, I've turned out to be a thriving and functional member of society. I have a bachelor's degree and I also have an MBA. I own multiple businesses and I have 2 children currently in public school in Sarasota County, one of which goes to Venice Middle. I send my kids to public school because I trust that the educators have been trained to understand the learning needs and the desires of the kids, along with what is appropriate. The book has already undergone a thorough review by these trained educators. Let's trust their judgment and trust the process. Who is this person that has decided that my child should not be allowed to read the book even after her child has written it, or read it? What are your credentials? Why do you feel the need to impose your will on me and my children and all the other children in the county? Why isn't it enough that your child's not allowed to read it? Some of the board members here ran on a platform of parental rights. I am a parent, respect my rights. Respect that our educators are doing their jobs. We trust these people to defend our children during a school shooting. We should trust that they have the educational degrees and wherewithal to understand that this book is just fine in our schools. Book banning is not okay, and it is an incredibly slippery slope. Finally, what are we doing here in the middle of the day on a Tuesday? If I didn't own my own businesses, I couldn't take off the 4 hours driving from Venice, an hour each way, that it takes for me to be here to talk about this. There's a lot of people here, and a lot of people that are already here that don't agree with banning this book, but there are a lot of people that weren't able to make it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, David Ford, and that will be the last speaker.
My name is David Ford, and I'm a resident of Sarasota County. We've already heard that it's basically been settled legally, academically. You have an awesome responsibility for the freedom and liberty of the parents of this county. The state prides itself on freedom and liberty. You can send a strong message that you support parents' freedom and liberty to choose what is correct and appropriate for their children. I hope that you will send that message loud and clear that this book will be in the Sarasota County school system. Thank you, and I really hope you make that decision.
Thank you very much. That concludes the hearing of citizens. The next item on the agenda is a motion. Is there a motion from the board regarding the challenged material? We have to leave today with some kind of action, so I will entertain a motion by a member of this board. Mr. Enos.
I move to go ahead and leave the book in place, have them use the representation that we had at the middle school. I believe it, the motion would be is to leave it currently as what is in place that we currently have as a standard using the recommendation of both of the committees in regarding to the age appropriateness.
I have a motion to maintain the current standing of the book with no additional changes. Is there a second? Sorry, I'm summarizing for is that an accurate? I don't want to make your motion for you. So there, I have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second on the floor. Are there any comments? Mr. Edwards?
Ms. Schuker, I really respect the fact that you utilized the process that is in place and you used it professionally and correctly. And for that, I commend you. For the policy that we have in place that has that system in place, I think that's a problem because I was opposed to that process from the beginning because when a parent objects to a particular book, the ability to have that child, or even, quite frankly, an instruction, if it's connected to instruction, if a parent objects to a particular lesson plan, they can object to that and an alternative is presented. And it doesn't affect the whole class, it doesn't affect 46,000 students, it doesn't affect all of what I really perceive to be individual freedom. That the parents have the right, the individual freedom right to make those choices for their children, and that another parent doesn't have the right to impose their views on that educational outcome for the other student. So but we live in a time where the culture wars have impacted, one other thing, the good part of that is, what I loved is at the school level, you did engage a really healthy conversation about taking it from 8th grade or from 6th grade to 8th grade. So there's got to be a forum where people with opposing views can sit down and have healthy discussions that don't really impact or have to go through this process, which is time consuming and expensive. I love that Mrs. Marinelli mentioned age appropriateness, because I'm going to use Rob, the sevens. They're kind of confusing, but in the I think it's 1467. I don't agree that we should be having sexual orientation conversations in K through 3. That's wrong. I've never even heard that happened. I asked that question 1,000 times from Sunday, and I never got a real response that happened. But then they slipped in that age-appropriate conversation, and as per Mrs. Marinelli, Mr. Manoogian, it's very gray. No one can define what that means, and therefore what we have are school teachers who aren't using school libraries. They aren't using their classroom libraries. They're afraid to discuss sexual orientation because they're afraid they're going to be sued. And at the end of the day, which is what I have been saying all along, it comes back to impact the student and, to what I heard today, the love of reading. We heard it all over the place, from adults to children that spoke. And so I think that we need to be very cautious and to make sure that our legislators know that these bills that were passed are having an adverse impact on our student outcomes. And I appreciate all of you here making sure that this board knew your feelings. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do respect all parents and their rights. I am not for book banning at all, but as a constitutional state officer, if indeed we were violating the law, that I would have to follow the law. But according to our attorney, we are not. So as far as I'm concerned, the book stays in our library. I personally would like to follow what the school decision was, but it's not up to my personal feelings. They recommended it be for 8th grade. That I think is appropriate. But I represent everyone, so that's why I agree with the motion, and I would not be in favor of banning the book as it stands now with the way the state law is, but I am not in favor of banning books, and I don't like that it has come up here, but I do appreciate the process, and I do appreciate everybody that put all the time into the process, because right now that's the best we have. And we have our professionals making the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any additional comments? So I'll go. I appreciate the process, and I respect the fact that I think about we have thousands and thousands upon books, and the process is such that I think it affords healthy debate, and I think this was very refreshing. It feels like it's been a really long time since there's been civil discussion with different and passionate opinions. But I also think there is an opportunity that if there is a member of the community or a parent that has some concern, there is a mechanism, and that goes on all sides, that there could be something that was brought forward that raises an alarm, and there is now a vehicle for someone, it always has been, for someone to bring that forward. And I shouldn't say always has been, but for as long as I've been here and quite before that, I do think that it's important to note that it is seldomly utilized. I think all of us, as we prepared for this meeting, were, even to the timing of it, is to make sure we afforded enough time, but we haven't been through it, so it's not abused. I think that's the other part, at least that I have witnessed. And this past year, again, and I'll speak from my personal experience, there are certain books that other districts have had that I that I believe largely from a grand scale, not just Bridget Ziegler, but many, many people of all different backgrounds and ideologies or what have you, have been in other districts, not ours, and I believe there's a strong backlash about that. I'm happy that that has not taken place in our school district, and I want to applaud, and I think that goes to a lot of the professionals that do very great work in Sarasota County schools. But I think of that as an example, and in the event that was made itself into our district, there is a mechanism for that to be challenged, and I don't want to remove that, and I want it to be removed for anybody. And there is a vetting process at the district level, at the school level, the district level, and yes, that would have implications across the board. And so I do understand that concern and hesitation from other families of saying, wait, I don't want my child to not have access to this. And so when I look at this, I think first, the word book banning and censorship and what have you, book banning, I think it's overused and it's an emotional word and nobody wants to be a part of book banning. But I do take the responsibility that we are tasked with recognizing we serve a diverse community with a myriad of backgrounds and different viewpoints and political backgrounds and religious beliefs and cultural backgrounds, and being respectful to that in a K-12 environment where we are tasked with the incredible responsibility of educating children that are minor children versus a public library where it's not specifically narrowly tailored to students. And that does create a challenge. And so trying to toe that line where you're not limiting things, but you're trying to be respectful of the age appropriateness, not making sure that there's a lot of access to a wide variety of content and material, but also aligning it to an age appropriate matter. And then what do we do when it's a complex subject matter? As mentioned here, and I read it. I mean, it's a heavy book. And I think it was very enlightening. And the question is that when we're talking about particularly middle school, and I would defer to my colleague who was an administrator of middle school for years, and I don't yet have middle schoolers. I feel like it's fast approaching. I'm terrified, but I know that that's a challenging time, and that's a very impressionable time for children. And so, but again, not wanting to hamper and keep that access, I always think of it, and it's interesting. We talk about parental rights. I certainly talk about it all the time. And this is a great example of where how can we empower all parents and assure that they have a seat at the table, because I want to make sure that that's the case. One parent's decision should not supersede another parent's decision. I've always said that. And then yet we have the ultimate responsibility of towing that line and putting guardrails in place. In my mind, when it's something like this, one of my questions was, is 8th grade appropriate? Do we have the right mechanisms in place? Or do we bump it up to high school? Because I absolutely think from a critical thinking component, as they are developing minds at that stage, I hope that they're able and capable to handle complex topics. But I also respect that there are different families that want to have different conversations. But when we're talking about middle school, the access, limiting the access only to 8th grade, is that the right place for it? Or do we bump it up to high school? Alternatively, one thing that Mr. Renoff and I brought up was, in general, for all books that may solve some issues here, would be to have a notification process to alert parents anytime at every grade, no matter what the book, to alert parents that they have checked out a book. I think that there's multitude of benefits from an academic standpoint. As a parent who's busy, sometimes you don't know, you can engage in that discussion, and it allows for parents to be more involved, which we all know is valuable. In the event the parent does not want that book to be read, then they have an opportunity there to invoke that. The challenge with opt-out is that's expecting every parent to have read every single book in a library, and that's just not a very reasonable, rational thing. So in my mind, this is allowing and empowering parents more. I think that we do have an obligation to flag a book in the proper way so that parents can decide if we maintain where it is today. So my request would be to amend this to require parental consent at the time of checking out the book, but it remain accessible to 8th grade. That would be my motion to amend, if there's a second.
Second.
So I have a motion and a second to amend the motion that it would add a parental consent notice in order for a student to check out this book as it remains. Are there any comments?
Yes.
Go, Mrs. Rose.
Quite complex, and thank you for recognizing 14 years of middle school, and I did I was very codependent on the people that were on the committee, and I'm still codependent on you in what your opinion is. What I've heard a lot today, and I look at the first response from the middle school principal, which is huge for me because it's directly addressing that administrator's community, and I do understand that school-based principal administrator was on your committee as well and broadened the conversation. I also look to what was successful for 14 years as a middle school administrator, and that was being cautious with sensitivity. I think ultimately, I looked at the way that we handled it, and we had the pleasure of building a system where there was a lot of communication. If teachers had books in their classroom, they would share what those books were in a syllabus, back to school event, and there was a lot of open dialogue. The world has gotten a lot more complicated, and I try to look for what is the happy medium, and when I hear the age appropriateness, that is a hard task. And brings sensitivity with it. And I only have, when it's all said and done, as a constitutional officer, legal counsel to lean on. And I hear there is, it could go either way with age appropriateness. And I think the answer has been to date that a student, if they looked at it and couldn't understand it, they'd put it back on the shelf. But I'm all said and done looking at all parties and the sensitivity, the age appropriateness, and to look at 8th grade on up, keeping it on the shelf and having the opportunity for anyone in 6th or 7th to absolutely have options to access the book.
Thank you. Mr. Enos.
The reason why I went to 6 through 12 is that I look at it as the overall, from the district level that looked at the book, the school actually said 8th, and then the district level administrator, the team that came together actually said 6th and up. And when I look at something like this, is when I do that, is that it's impactful not just at Venice Middle School, it'd be impactful at Pineview, it's impactful all the way across the board, no matter where you're at. So ultimately, I believe that when you look at the consistency of Florida state statutes, you look at ultimately when you bring everything to the light, obviously people's opinions when it comes to this stuff has to be, is you only get growth from being able to have differing of opinions. Without that, you really don't have anything. So with that being said, that's why I ultimately took the overall district recommendation of 6 through 12, again, based upon all the different students that obviously, as we talk about what's age appropriateness for a student that's at such and such program or at a different program, ultimately that's why I looked at it as saying is it should be that level across the board based upon, because it impacts just not Venice Middle School, it impacts everyone.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards.
Yes, thank you. I am concerned about the amendment for a lot of reasons. I believe in parents' rights. I've never opposed parents' rights, and I think there are plenty of what has been said that the policy of not allowing each parent or allowing a parent to restrict a book is the appropriate policy. When you start, and I appreciate Mrs. Ziegler saying that this system, this process has not been abused, and once again I cite Mrs. Euchre's engagement of the discussion, which I think having a healthy discussion of opposing views is a good idea. So I'm not trying to take that away, but that amendment, it encourages the process. Even though it hasn't been abused, it could become abused for what we're just seeing, that anybody could challenge a book and off we go to the races and we end up back here again. And it would mean that one book needs to be notified, that we're notifying a parent. Do we have to notify for 350 books or 2,000 books, and then the librarian and then we have to start trying to figure out how we get around that system? I think it's I think we've all had a healthy discussion. Think we've all heard the opposing views, and we've gotten to a place where it's comfortable to keep the book as it is. So I will not be supporting the amendment.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And I think that, especially as we look forward, and I'm trying to find a balancing act of where it's not going to be precluded, so that as many, and I've heard read many of the emails from many families not wanting that to be limited, but there are many other families that are not in support of that and would want that ability to chime in and say, no, I don't want, this is not something I want my child to read at this time for any reason. And so it's not us infringing or overstepping, it's really empowering those families to make that decision. And that way it's not eliminated from the circulation, it's just adding that to the next layer. Certainly as I know there's a number of vetting of books in the future, I don't know, I know there's a lot of work with that, but I think, with where I was thinking, especially as the next step, is trying to engage families in a manner that will balance it and support the different decisions, but also really also help staff kind of we have lots of focus and work to do from the instructional level, so that really is putting parents in the driver's seat in a more of a way. So that is my motion. Again, just to restate it, is to require parental consent to check this book out while remaining still in middle school. We have a motion and a second on the floor, so we will do a voice vote for the amendment. Oh,
Didn't we? We already had a motion and a second on the first one.
I amended it.
Oh, okay. Well, then.
So you said, well, I'll take it a formal vote, but Mrs. Marinelli?
Please clarify what we're voting on.
Oh, yeah, so, okay, so there's a motion and amendment to the motion on the floor. The amendment is to require parental notification for this book while it remains in circulation at the middle school level.
So we're voting on the amendment.
The amendment, yes.
Thank you.
Is that clear? Everyone good? Okay. Mrs. Marinelli?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
No.
Mrs. Rose?
Yes.
Mr. Enos?
No.
And the chair votes aye, and the amendment passes 3-2. So now the motion on the floor is to allow the book to remain with parental notification in middle school. And unless there are any additional comments, we can take a vote on the final motion. Any other comments? No? Okay, Mrs. Marinelli?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mrs. Rose?
I'm going to have to apologize. I'm confused.
That's okay.
Can you restate exactly what we're voting on?
So there was an amendment that was to require parental notification. So the book stays, doesn't get taken out, but it would require parental notification to be checked out. And that passed 3-2. Now that becomes the main motion, so that the motion ultimately is the book titled Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi remains in circulation in Sarasota County schools, accessible in middle school, with requiring parental consent to be checked out.
And yes.
Okay. Mr. Enos?
Yes.
And the chair votes aye, and the motion passes 5-0. And just to clarify for the record, the motion was that the book titled Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi is to remain in Sarasota County schools, middle schools, requiring parental consent when being checked out by a student. And that is the motion. Seeing no additional comments, this hearing is adjourned.